exciting program for the evening. I'm going to just lay out just a few basic Zoom ground rule-y type things, and then I'll do a very brief intro to narrative medicine, and then I'll move us on. I'm Nellie Herman. I'm the creative director of the program in narrative medicine at Columbia University. Just the basic bullet points I want to tell you about tonight's program. First, please keep your microphones muted. We're just to cut down on background noise and disruptions in the program. Along those lines, just be warned that if there's any disruptions or inappropriate things happening, it may result in your being taken out of the Zoom, so just be aware of that. We are going to lock the meeting in a few minutes just to keep security as secure as we can. If after we lock the meeting, anyone's internet goes out, or for whatever reason you drop off the call, because the meeting will be locked, you will not be able to get back on. So in the event that happens, just know that after the event, you're all going to get an email that has a link to the YouTube recording of this event, so you will be able to watch it even if you get off for whatever reason. But just know you won't be able to come back in. In the unlikely event, we have learned this lesson the hard way, so I have to make this announcement. In the unlikely event that we have a Zoom bombing episode, just know that we will terminate the event right away. We're not going to give you warning. We'll just end it right away. And again, we have done everything we can to make sure that's not going to happen, but just saying. And we will send a new link out in the event that happens. You'll get a new link in your inbox to a new session. Another just detail, please keep the chat box to the minimum. We're going to try and keep the event focused on the live in-person part. There will come a point later in the evening when Nigel will invite questions from you guys, the audience. At that point, we invite you to please type questions into the chat box, but just try and we're really not going to be watching the chat very closely, and we want to keep the focus on the event. So please just try and not chat into the box until you get invited to. As I said, the event is being recorded, and after it's available, after it's done and posted, we will email a link out to all of you and all the people who are registered. So you will get that link in your inbox automatically, and you can share that link however you wish. And then I think that's it in terms of nuts and bolts on Zoom. Joe, just shake your head if I missed anything, but I think that's it. So with that, I will give a more warm, friendly welcome to everyone who's here. Thank you so much for joining us. We don't normally do narrative medicine rounds in the summertime, but silver lining of this strange time we're in is that we can come together in a new format and at new time. So we're very happy to have a great event for you tonight. Narrative medicine, for those of you who don't know us or what we do, we are a program at Columbia. We do lots of things, and I'm not going to try and summarize them, but basically we work with and around storytelling and creativity and in healthcare, and the mashing up of all of those good things. And the book that we are going to talk about tonight is perfectly fits into everything that we do. So we're really excited about that. I'm going to pass the mic on to my colleague, Nigel Hatton, who is going to really moderate the rest of the evening. Just a brief intro to Nigel. He is an associate professor of literature and philosophy and critical race and ethnic studies at the University of California, Merced. He's a founding member of the Critical Refugee Studies Collective and part of the faculty committee for the Prison University Project at San Quentin. he is a great friend of ours. He's done lots of stuff with narrative medicine. He's also completed the certificate in the program in narrative medicine. And we're so happy that he is gonna do this event for us tonight. So without further ado, unless Joe shakes his head at me, I can see his screen. No, he's happy. Okay, so I think I've said everything I need to say. Thank you all again for joining us, and Nigel, take it away.
Oh, great. Thank you, Nellie. And thank you to the Narrative Medicine program. It's an extreme honor to introduce a scholar whose work I admire in the context of a program that I greatly admire, the Narrative Medicine program. Dr. Nicole Fleetwood is Professor of American Studies and Art History at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. She is a writer, curator, and art critic whose interests and publications addressed important topics such as contemporary Black diasporic art and visual culture, photography studies, art and public practice, performance studies, gender and feminist studies, Black cultural history, prison abolition and carceral studies, and poverty studies. The intersections of these concerns are dealt with in great depth, care, critical insight, and historical mining and mapping in her many publications, among them 3 books. The first, Troubling Vision, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness, published in 2010 from University of Chicago Press, is a powerful interrogation of American public culture and America's fixation on Black visibility. In that award-winning book, Dr. Fleetwood argues that, quote, Blackness and Black life become intelligible and valued, as well as consumable and disposable through racial discourse. Blackness, in this sense, circulates. She continues, Blackness fills in space between matter, between object and subject, between bodies, between looking and being looked upon. It fills in the void and is the void. Through its circulation, Blackness attaches to bodies and narratives coded as such, but it always exceeds these attachments, end quote. That book, Troubling Vision, was the recipient of the 2012 Laura Romero First Book Publication Prize of the American Studies Association. I read this book voraciously. I read it voraciously upon its publication in 2010, returned to it year after year, and I read it again last year when I came across a copy at the Portland Art Museum accompanying the retrospective for the artist Hank Willis Thomas. My point is that her scholarship is everywhere in the hands of scholars, artists, community activists, curators, political leaders, intervening in and shaping local, national, and global discourses, institutions, and ideas. It is also in Troubling Vision that readers learn that having an incarcerated family member is among the many concerns Dr. Fleetwood carries with her. Her second book is titled On Racial Icons, Blackness and the Public Imagination, from Rutgers University Press in 2015. The book pressures a troubling paradox. The circulation and obsession with iconic photographs and images of Black political leaders, celebrities, and sports heroes is often accompanied by diminished attention to important social and political issues that impact Black life. Chapter 1 is titled, I Am Trayvon Martin, the Boy Who Became an Icon. The book also helps us to see and think about photographs of Barack Obama, Diana Ross, Serena Williams, and LeBron James. Her third book, Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, Harvard University Press, 2020, we will hear about today. In addition to her books, Dr. Fleetwood's articles have appeared in the important journals African American Review, American Quarterly, Aperture, Callaloo, The Conversation, Lip Hub, Public Books, Public Culture, Signs, and many art catalogs and edited anthologies. She's the co-editor of the important Aperture magazine edition Prison Nation, a special issue focusing on photography's role in documenting mass incarceration. She is the recipient of many of this nation's most important fellowships and has curated exhibitions and public programs on art and mass incarceration at the Andrew Friedman Home, Aperture, Cleveland Public Library, and many other installations. Listing Dr. Fleetwood's entirety of accomplishments could take up this entire Zoom call, so I'll stop here and return to the book that is at the center of today's program. I want to end with a reference to a review of Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, that appeared in the Los Angeles Times. The reviewer, Daniel Fernandez, noted how, quote, mass culture has been remarkably successful in commodifying the horrors and humiliation of incarceration. but that it has done little to create a movement that might challenge the laws, political actors, and institutions that permit these routine abuses to happen. Nicole Fleetwood's new book, Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, and her call for, quote, a future without human caging, he continues, is a corrective to this trend. Indeed, it is a corrective. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fleetwood to Narrative Medicine Rounds.
Thank you so much, Nigel, for that beautiful introduction. I really appreciate it. It was very moving. Nigel and I are alums from the same program at Stanford, although he's much younger than I am. So, and thank you, Nellie, and Narrative Medicine crew for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. I'm also excited that later this evening, I'll be joined by Lisette Oblitas, who works at Columbia. She's also a student there, and she is one of the featured artists in my book, and she's someone I've learned a ton from. But we've never been in public conversation, so it's going to be great to have her join. The way that I like to talk about the book and just kind of present generally is through images. I'm a visual person, so I'm going to walk you through images from the book and kind of narrate the book visually, and then for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll be in conversation with Lisette, and then Nigel will join us. But I do see that, just excuse me for a minute, I'm going to turn on the lights in my apartment, because when I got on for testing my images an hour ago, it was much lighter, and I know it's going to get dark on me. So just let me turn on the lights really quickly. Thank you for that. So I want to start by just telling you a little bit about how the book came into being. Can everyone hear me fine? Are we good sound-wise? Okay. So as Nigel said, I grew up in Southwest Ohio, and I come from a family that's been deeply impacted by hyper-incarceration, punitive policing, long sentences. And I'm not the only one in my community. Actually, growing up in the 80s and 90s, I witnessed so many people that I grew up with, so many, especially young Black boys, just enter prison system, enter often for many years, some to never to return. Some died there, some are still serving sentences there. And I grew up not really having words to describe what was happening, but feeling a lot of despair and also shame, feeling the kind of shame that was placed upon my community and a lot of working class and working poor Black communities, especially as prisons ratcheted up and blamed the very people targeted for hyper-incarceration. And so about 10 years ago, actually, when I finished my very first book, Troubling Vision, I wanted to do a project that just felt like it really connected to my family experience and my personal experience growing up in Southwest Ohio, but I didn't know what that project was going to be. And at the same time, I was like coming to terms with like this collection of photographs that had amassed over a period of time of visiting incarcerated relatives. And so like 2010, 2011, like literally I just started hanging these photos in my house. And these are photographs from Ohio prisons of me visiting incarcerated relatives. This here is a visit 10 years ago to see my cousin Alan and my cousin DeAndre, who at the time were in the same prison together. And so, in like kind of just hanging these pictures around the house, I mean, I was just like, and I would start talking to them. I know it sounds crazy, but this is narrative medicine. So it was really deeply this kind of healing experience for me of like, just actually like finding a way of communicating, as symbolic as it sounds, with my cousins who were, completely invisible to me. And at most I saw them once or twice a year when I traveled from California at first, where I went to Stanford, and I would travel back once or twice a year to Ohio. And then when I was in New York, I moved to New York, I do the same. And every time I go visit them, we take these pictures. And these pictures are, really, often having spoken to relatives of incarcerated people, these pictures are so important, they're invaluable, and they're also just like laden with so much pain and often regret, and they're hard to like deal with in one's everyday life because of all of the horror that's attached to prisons and how prisons separate and isolate families, especially families most impacted. So this is my cousin Alan with his daughter Tanisha, and Alan was sentenced to life when he was 18 and Tanisha was like a couple of months old. And thankfully Alan was released in 2015, and Tanisha at the time was 21 and was pregnant with her own child. So her entire childhood, he was in prison. So what I started doing over a period of time is when people asked me to come give talks, like at universities, art centers, community centers, I literally just, I mean, it was storytelling. I'd say anecdotalizing. I'd show these images and I would talk about my incarcerated relatives. And at the time I didn't know where the project was going, but over the course of like years of doing this, other people would come up to me and they'd start sharing about their experiences with incarcerated relatives, or they'd say, you know, I have these photographs I want to share with you, or artwork. And it was actually through doing this kind of work that I connected with Lisette Oblitas, who she and I started communicating in 2015. I gave a presentation at Princeton University, and at the time, a grad student there had met Lisette through an arts program that he was a part of in York Correctional. So she and I will talk a little bit more about that later. But my point is that just in the act of sharing, the act of publicly sharing, is what created this project. I had, like, over the course of the 10 years, hundreds of people, I mean literally hundreds of people, come up and make this project possible. They would give me access to art. They connect me with artists or with teachers or with activists. And so I say with a lot of pride that this is a collective project, that this book is like 350 something pages. It's 2 pounds. I know, because I've been sending lots out during quarantine. And every single page is the work of many, many people who supported me and who were involved with it. So the basis of the project is actually over 70 interviews that I did with currently and formerly incarcerated artists and activists, teachers, and the like. And I use the stories that they shared with me and their experiences to like really think about the impact of that mass incarceration, that the rise in the carceral state have had on everyday culture, on visual culture. And really for me, as someone who's an art historian, someone deeply invested in art, thinking about the impact in visible and less visible ways on contemporary art practices and art institutions. So I'm just gonna walk you through some images, as I said, and I'm really looking forward to being in conversation later. So this here's a picture of my cousin Alan, and I really love this portrait, and it was a portrait he commissioned for Valentine's Day that he sent to all the women in his family, in our family. And you know, in the book I talk about this portrait for a while, and I talk about it because it is like this visual image of like self-presentation in a system where there's very little space for self-presentation, and where mugshots and prison ID photos are really the kind of dominant ways in which incarcerated people are represented. And when I received this image from him, I was just like so moved by the tenderness. And I also like to share with people, especially people who are not aware of like how prison systems work, that this was also, not only is it like emotional labor on behalf of Alan, but it's also like financially really costly for him, because each of these photographs taken in prison costs $2.50, and prison laborers, for the most part, they're making less than $1 an hour. So, you know, this act of like sending these out is, again, a practice of belonging, of staying attached to the family, and it's also one that's quite extractive for incarcerated people and their loved ones. From working with the set of images of my family, I actually started to just like do more research and come across artists, especially a lot of young contemporary Black artists who are doing work with their own family archives, work around the prison state. And one is Dino Lawson, who's a well-known contemporary Black photographer working out of Brooklyn. She's really well-known for like her portraits of Black everyday subjects. And she also has done this series called Mohawk Correctional Facility that's based on photographs, acquired images of her cousin Jasmine during Jasmine's visit to her partner Eric over the course of the 2.5 years when he was in prison. And I like to show these images alongside the images of my family, because these are what art historians and photographers call vernacular photographs. They're photographs that are meant for usually private consumption. They're kind of everyday photographs. The image is often more important than like the kind of aesthetic or compositional quality of it. But they have, during this kind of moment where there's more and more interest in mass incarceration, you've seen more and more of these vernacular prison photographs entering museum collections. And an example is this collection that Dino Lawson has collected of her relatives. Through this research, especially the research I was doing around photography, in 2017, 2018, I collaborated with Aperture, which is a foundation that focuses on photography, especially what we might call art photography. They were interested in doing a special issue on thinking about the role of photography in documenting mass incarceration. So I came on as the co-editor and also then a co-curator of a touring exhibition that's still going around the country called Prison Nation. And I want to show you a few of the images that are in Prison Nation, and also talk about like one of the ways that I got access. To me, this project is a lot about method, and it's and I love that this is a narrative medicine program, because I know that method is something that writers and people in the medical field have to think about a lot, and also practices of care. And so curating, the root of curating is in care. And for me, this project, over the course of all these years of working on it, really was a project that had to do with my own personal experience, my research mandate, and also like an ethics and practice of care. And so it took me a few years to really get access to a lot of the rich visual material that I thought was available, but that I did not know how to access in prisons. And initially what I had access to was photography, and photography often done by non-incarcerated people. And I say that because in most prisons across the country, incarcerated people have limited, if any, access to visual or recording technologies. These technologies are used by the state often to surveil and to control prison populations. But you often do find journalists, photojournalists, or contemporary art photographers, documentarians who do have access to prisons, and they do studies that become really important ways of the public understanding the conditions of prison. And Chandra McCormick and Keith Calhoun, who work out of New Orleans, are two Black photographers, who have since the early 80s been documenting the impact of the carceral state, especially in Louisiana. And Louisiana is often called the prison capital of the world. It has the notorious distinction of it's either Oklahoma or Louisiana that's often called the prison capital of the world, because the United States is the country that incarcerates more people than any place on the planet, and Louisiana and Oklahoma do incarcerate a higher percentage of their state population than any other state. Louisiana especially is quite notorious because many of its prisons function on what are penal farms, or former slave plantations that are now places where in the contemporary era, people are still forced to pick cotton, for example. And here's a work gang, an incarcerated work gang in Louisiana at Angola prison. Angola is also notorious for being a former slave plantation, but also being the largest maximum security prison in the country, where there's almost 6,000 people incarcerated there, and the vast majority will die on site at Louisiana because Angola, because Louisiana is a state that rarely gives parole. So life sentence there is usually natural life. Another photographer who like kind of informed the project, and I want to share with you in terms of whose work also appears in the book, is Sarah Bennett. And Sarah Bennett has spent much of her career as either criminal defense attorney, and again, in terms of just thinking about narration. So she worked as a criminal defense attorney working with women who had received often life sentences or very long sentences, often as survivors of violence. And she actually turned to photography because she found that like the written word, that the files that she would use in court didn't fully humanize or individualize the women she represented. So she started to photograph incarcerated women and formerly incarcerated women. And one project that emerged from this work, this visual advocacy work, is In the Bedroom Project, where she photographs women who have been sentenced to life, then released in their very first bedrooms after being released. So now I'm going to turn attention to work that, I guess I was saying, it took me some years to get to the work that I couldn't figure out how to access in terms of like method. And I had gone through IRB, which many of you in the medical field know what that's about in terms of being able, human subject protocol research. And I started to make contact with organizations that had established art and education programs in prison. And so through those organizations, I started to get access to incarcerated artists, and kind of that kind of snowballed from there. And so one of the artists that I write about in the book and whose work really inspires me, his name is Eddie Cates. He's currently in prison in New Jersey. He's been in prison since for over 30 years. And when he was in his early 60s, he decided to enroll in a art appreciation course that was taught through NJ STEP. And NJ STEP is in New Jersey is a large consortium of higher ed institutions, of which Rutgers is a part, that then brings education and art programs into New Jersey prisons. And so I was really inspired when I learned about Eddie Cates through his art teacher, and this source photograph that he was given of an early 20th century chain gang. And this was in a lesson that was about kind of introducing graphite to the students. And so you see his rendering of this really powerful photograph into a really, also an equally powerful drawing. What this also for me is illustrative of is many of the things that come up for incarcerated artists, and many incarcerated artists are deeply engaged in studying prisons and the history of prisons, and are aware of like chain gangs and convict labor and this kind of long continuation of forced labor and incapacitation of poor Black people, Indigenous people, Latinx people, and also poor white people. And so a recurring theme for a lot of incarcerated artists is thinking about racial capitalism, forced labor, and the targeting of specific populations. And so you have another reflection of these kind of things in a watercolor by James Huff called I Am the Economy. And James Huff is someone who is, thankfully will be celebrating his 1-year anniversary of being released from prison this August. He was in prison for 27 years in Pennsylvania. He was sentenced to life without parole as a teenager, a sentence that is now rendered unconstitutional. And because it was rendered unconstitutional, he was able to appeal and be released. Over the course of his 27 years in prison, he created thousands of works of art. And he also mentored dozens of younger artists coming up, and just became this really powerful influence on the lives of a lot of people who were incarcerated with him. Here he's quite literally reflecting on racial capitalism, and he's also thinking about the ways that prison industries benefit and profit from the labor of incarcerated people. So this is a part of a series. One is I Am the Economy, and this is called How Big House Products Make Boxer Shorts. And in the corner, you'll see an actual label from the company, the prison industry that operates in prisons in the state of Pennsylvania. It's called Big House Products. And so incarcerated people, for example, make boxer shorts for, you know, a few cents an hour. And then those boxer shorts are sold back to them at exorbitant prices. So this is the kind of way that he and other incarcerated artists are thinking thematically about extractive labor and racial capitalism inside prisons. So let's see. And for me, what was important in the book, and also I'm working on, I should say, I have an exhibition that I'm curating at MoMA PS1. It was scheduled to open in April when the book was launched, but because of the pandemic, it's been postponed. And we're hoping that if all continues to go well and the viral count is stabilized or continues to go down in New York, that the show will open in the fall. And I say that to say, in thinking about the exhibition and thinking about the book itself, it was very important for me to really come up with aesthetic categories to talk about the work of James Huff and all the artists in the book that I felt like really recognize the kind of experimentation that's taking place in prison. And I'll talk to you more about what I mean by that. Often the history of prisons has been a history of prison art. So it's like, I'm not creating a new category, nor am I writing about like a new phenomenon. I think what's different and unique about my book is that I'm thinking about how mass incarceration has impacted the art world because of the sheer fact that the numbers of people who are like living long sentences in prison is so astronomically high that by its very structure is going to impact culture and how we understand culture, and also the relationship between incarcerated and non-incarcerated people. So one of the things I do say in the book, though, is that the history of incarceration, the history of captivity, the history of people being held against their will is the history of people creating, dreaming, envisioning freedom. So that I want to say that as a kind of larger structure for thinking about the book. But I also know that the history of people talking about art and captivity has been one often where people use categories like untutored, outsider art, unschooled, self-trained, and not that these categories or terms are in and of themselves, quote, bad, but my concern is how they marginalize people who are deeply and rigorously involved in aesthetic experiments and artistic practices that might take place on the margins or outside of established art circles. So I was very interested in thinking about how the work, for example, of James Huff is in conversation with well-known contemporary artists. For example, this is you can't see the label because I forgot to turn it white, but it's Cameron Roland, and Cameron Roland is an established conceptual artist. He won a MacArthur Genius Award last year, and his career has been one where he's explored issues of racial capitalism, of imprisonment, of the history of kind of racial captivity. And this installation that he did at the Essex Street Gallery in about 5 years ago, all of the objects in the show are objects that come out of prisons that were made by prison labor. So for me, it's really important to think about how James Huff and Cameron Roland are involved in very similar conceptual practices. So one of the things that I think about and look at, and so what I talk, if I, bringing up Cameron Roland and James Huff, for example, I talk about like a category, a way of thinking about art that's made in prisons or art that's responding to the carceral state as carceral aesthetics. So these are kind of aesthetic practices that come out of conditions of imprisonment, but that are also reflective of like the very kind of structures and ideology of the carceral state. And I look at how even when artists are released from prison, that type of aesthetic engagement still influences their work. And so Gil Battle is a great example of that. Gil Battle was incarcerated in California for many years. And he's a Filipino-American artist. And I say that now because he and I have been in touch, and we're going to be doing a talk next week, actually, through Brooklyn Rail, but he's now back in the Philippines, and he continues to make art. And after his release, he etched a series, this really incredible, detailed series of reliefs on ostrich eggs using dental tools. And they're all narratives from his experience or experiences he witnessed that he's accounting for during his time in prison in California. And here's another example of that. And in this relief, you see just kind of everyday objects of incarcerated people. So you see a roll of toilet paper, soap, prison soap, a comb, toothbrush, and these are items that are given to someone when they're first kind of indexed and brought into the prison system. And so again, I mentioned Lisette, and one of the ways that I met Lisette is I was interested in also like collaborative art that takes place in prison. So I have an entire chapter 5, called Imaginaries, where I look at how contemporary artists, especially socially engaged artists and nonprofit organizations that are committed to social justice practices, their politics of collaborating with incarcerated artists. And one of the organizations that I look at is out of California, and you see incarcerated people here with the label that incarcerated people in California have to wear. But the organization is called the William James Association, and they're known for doing a lot of public art projects, murals and the like, throughout the state of California. And then a project that I opened chapter 5 talking about is this project that Lisette was involved in. Lisette, do you mind just like raising your hand so that people know who you are on this Zoom? Can you just like, there's Lisette. Lisette's gonna be chatting with me very soon. And Lisette was involved in this really incredible project. Lisette, I'm just gonna mention it, and then I really would like for you to talk about it, because Lisette was actually instrumental in conceiving of this project. And it started when the Brooklyn Museum, the Sackler Feminist Arts Center came to York Correctional in Connecticut, where Lisette was serving time at and did a presentation on feminist art, specifically thinking about Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party. Lisette and the group present, Lisette will tell you more about, they were really inspired, but they also really wanted to like, not just be like the recipients of this information, but they wanted to actually create. And what they did is they turned that opportunity, that like 1-day workshop, into this like 6-month peer learning group where they collaborated and they created their own placemats of women who were influential in their own lives, and using the materials that were available to them in prison. Here's a close-up of Lisette's placemat, and I'm going to let her tell you more about the significance of that later. But the installation Shared Dining actually debuted at the Brooklyn Museum in 2015 in the room right next to the dinner party. And it was really moving, being able to move between those two installations and think about the material and symbolic history of women, especially women who've been rendered invisible through the prison industrial complex. I also think about collaborations that take place from inside prisons. So many of these collaborations are collaborations that are brought to incarcerated people by outside organizations, by established artists, and often they can, if people aren't really thoughtful and deliberate, they can reproduce all kinds of power imbalances. So it's, I write about like the importance of really just thinking rigorously through the politics of imprisonment and what it means to go in and to be able to have the kind of mobility and the recognition to go in and to go out. But I also look at collaborations that start inside prisons and then kind of go out of prisons. And one is a group that formed in San Quentin among some lifers, called Prison Renaissance, where they created an art journal and kind of collaborations with various organizations out in the San Francisco Bay Area, including some students at Stanford University. And so I just want to show you that as an example of a type of collaboration that starts from the inside and that kind of manifests itself out. And that's interested in similar ways in just like breaking down that kind of inside-outside divide. So let me see where, I'll talk for like 10 more minutes. Is that good, Noe? Okay. So in terms of thinking about carceral aesthetics, I said one of the ways that I like frame the book and think about like the work of people inside prison, the work of people outside prison, but they're doing either similar like kind of work conceptually or sometimes even using similar material, is through this category of carceral aesthetics, which is like the production of art in prison or in response to mass incarceration. And then within that category, I think about like, well, what are the conditions under which people actually make art, especially art inside prison? And it's framed very differently than like making art in any other kind of setting. So I say like art made in prisons is, you know, it's very much a response to the institutional confinement of being in prison. There's, for me, there's no way of divorcing it from that institutional relationship. And so I talk about, for example, how what I call penal time, and that's experiencing time as punishment. And that's a kind of modern framework for thinking about punishment, which is that you're sentenced to time. That's something that we have, that like, you know, in the last couple of 100 years that we have used that as like the most dominant way of inflicting legal punishment. You know, even if someone's not sentenced to prison, they're on probation for X amount of time. They're, you know, so we use time as a way of punishing. And so I look at how incarcerated people are thinking about what I call penal time or time as punishment. And often it is through thinking about the long history of racial subjugation and captivity. And you can see that very strikingly through this triptych that Jared Owens made. Jared Owens was incarcerated in Ferryton, which is a federal prison in New Jersey, for over a decade. When he left with soil from the prison yard, which I call penal matter. I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a minute. And he's been making work thinking about this kind of long history of subjugation and captivity. And this here is called Elapsium, where he's overlaid the floor plan of the prison where he was incarcerated with this 18th century iconic image called the Brooke slave ship. And the Brooke slave ship was a really important visual that British and American abolitionists used to educate a larger public about the horrors of slavery. And you can see by the title that he is making a case for this kind of long continuation of racial subjugation. And again, these are some of the thematics and conditions out of which incarcerated people make art. Here's another visual of Elapsium. Mary Elizabeth Enoch Baxter, you see the title of her work. This is also a triptych. It's a video where she borrows the title, again, from abolitionists, from Sojourner Truth, her very famous speech about where she's talking about the particular conditions of Black women in Black freedom struggles and also in women's liberation struggles. And so Mary is continuing that tradition of Black feminist freedom struggles. And she talks about in her video, Ain't I a Woman, which you can see the entire thing on YouTube, about her experience in prison in Pennsylvania, where she was in labor and was shackled, a practice that still takes place in many states, while she's in labor for 43 hours. And then she had to have an emergency C-section where she remains shackled while she's under surgery. And then what happens to her after the surgery? And I'm happy to talk with you more about her and her incredible work, but she's become this activist. She's out of prison. She's working out of Philadelphia. She's very active in helping people get out of prison right now during the COVID pandemic, and also to state by state in this practice of shackling imprisoned women who are in labor. So that's, then I talk about also penal space, and penal space is to me really like powerfully reflected in this self-portrait by Ronnie Goodman, who was at the time incarcerated in San Quentin. And he does this self-portrait of an artist at work himself, while also being in the a workshop space that where art classes take place at San Quentin. So this is one example of like thinking about this kind of spatial captivity, and this is quite a rich and sizable space compared to one that's well-resourced, compared to most spaces where incarcerated people make art. Most of the art takes place in 6 foot by 9 foot cells. Much of the art is clandestine because in some places, depending on what kind of materials they're using, they can have their art confiscated and the like. So another way that I think about penal space is also the kind of psychic or symbolic space that artists are creating for themselves through art making. And Tamika Cole made this really powerful graphite collage while she was incarcerated in Alabama, and she was experiencing abuse by the guards. And she said the only way that she could respond to that abuse was through art making itself, because anything she would say would just lengthen her sentence or make her punishment so severe. So art becomes this kind of this symbolic space for her own survival. But I also talk about some of the most austere, embarrassed, and cruelest spaces in a prison system that's known for all forms of cruelty, and that's supermax and solitary, long-term solitary confinement. And so Carnell Honeycutt, who's currently incarcerated in New Mexico, has spent many years being moved around supermax prisons. And here is an illustration, figure A, figure B, that he's made of the cell, the supermax cell where he spent many years in Connecticut. I have a chapter that I dedicate to solitary confinement, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in terms of the kind of the particular vulnerabilities of people who are suffering in solitary confinement. And then I talk a lot throughout the book around what I call penal matter, and that's like the material constraints that shape the art making inside prison and all the incredible experimentations and risk-taking that incarcerated people take in order to make art in prison. This here is by Kenneth Reams, and it's called Capitalization. And it's a collection of the food, the kind of junk food and the vending machine food that's available to incarcerated people in the death row unit in Arkansas, where Kenneth Reams is currently in solitary confinement. He's been there for 27 years. He was sentenced when he was 18 years old, the youngest person to be sentenced to death row in a contemporary era in Arkansas, also for a crime called felony murder, where he wasn't the person who actually committed the killing, but he was there and he was given capital punishment. He was on my book launch with me. He's a very active in art making, and also as an activist working to free himself from death row, but also on behalf of other incarcerated artists and people who've been sentenced to life and to death. Other examples of what I call penal matter is the work of Dean Gillespie, who in his 20 years in prison in Ohio used all kinds of items that he could collect from the prison to innovate these incredible miniatures. And he would then find a way of sending them out to his parents. And over those 20 years, he literally filled his parents' garage with these miniatures. And this dinette here, I just want to say, like, for example, it shows the way that incarcerated people also kind of work together on behalf of art, in the service of art. And so what looks like the little like gravets in that hold the dinette together are actually sewing pin needles that a fellow incarcerated person was able to sneak out from the sewing room. The exterior is actually the inside foil from cigarette wrappers. The curtains are used tea bags. It's all these kind of like the kind of material constraints of prison he then aestheticizes into these really incredible miniatures. Okay, so let me show you a few more. a lot of incarcerated people will use prison-issued items on behalf of making art. And a really great example is Jesse Crimes' Apocalyptine, which consists of 39 prison bed sheets that he made over a 3-year period. And so he used the prison bed sheets as canvases. He had no idea how this like massive work was going to come together until he was released from prison. And he uses things like the New York Times, Sunday Magazine for images, and he then things like hair gel and toothpaste as like image transfers. And this is an installation of that same piece at the Eastern State Historic Site in Philadelphia. It's a permanent installation of it. Here's a close-up detail of that. Here's another work by Jesse that is, again, using what I call penal matter, and it's prison soap bars. And he's transferred onto the prison soap bars images he's taken out of like legal briefings and the newspapers of mugshots or arrest photos of people. Here's a close-up detail from that. Gilberto Rivera is also someone else who's working with prison-issued items. So this is called Institutional Nightmare, and it uses his own prison uniform that he's deconstructed to turn into this mixed media painting here. And then Jared Owens, who was incarcerated with Jesse Crimes in Gilberto, and they created this multiracial art collective in Ferriton, and it was one of the only spaces where you could kind of work across racial and ethnic differences, and where they also were very involved in like political theory and just anti-racist practices inside prison. And for Jared to kind of explore penal matter was to think about color and the way that color shaped the experience of incarcerated people. And so he told me that, for example, orange was a warning color for incarcerated people there. And so it was if they crossed an orange line, they could get in trouble. And blue, for example, was the color of the prison guard's uniform. And brown, a kind of tan color that you used in the backdrop, was the color of the uniforms that incarcerated people wore. So I'm gonna move forward because I wanna make sure we have time to talk, but I wanna look at some portraiture and show you another image by Lisette, and we can end on that image. So one of the things, Lisette asked me a question that she's gonna ask me again later, and I'll just kind of cheat a little bit. She asked me about some things that I learned. And one of the things that that blew my mind in working on this project is the importance of portraiture inside prisons. And there's a really, I mean, portrait art is one of the kind of longest and often considered one of the more conventional of Western art traditions. And incarcerated people really turn some of those value systems on their head, and they use portraiture in all kinds of innovative ways, and also in very kind of practical ways. And so, for example, portraiture is a form of currency in prison. Incarcerated people will barter around like having a portrait made of one's daughter, of one's loved one, for like coffee or for some other commissary items. Portrait artists are often very much in demand inside prison. If you're a really good portrait artist, it's like an elevated status. People are seeking you out. People are often willing to, you know, trade or pay you all kinds of things to have a really beautiful rendition done of themselves or of their loved ones. George Anthony Morton is a formerly incarcerated artist who established himself as a really talented, powerful portrait artist during his 10 years in prison. And once he was released, he actually got a scholarship to the Florence Academy, which is this really prestigious academy that's all about the tradition of Italian portraiture. And so he went to Florence and was able to study with some of the senior teachers there. Here's another portrait by George Anthony Morton. Here is a portrait session by Ronnie Goodman. Ronnie Goodman, I showed you his self-portrait of him in that San Quentin workshop space earlier in the presentation. And here you see him actually in practicing portrait making with one of his sitters, a fellow incarcerated person in San Quentin. And then you see the final results, which we'll have several of Ronnie Goodman's portraits on display at the MoMA PS1 exhibition when it opens. And Ronnie Goodman, I like to show this video still of him because he's such an interesting person. And in addition to becoming a really accomplished artist in prison, he was a long distance runner before he went to prison, and he continued that tradition on the prison yard, which is a very like monotonous place to just run. But he created something called the San Quentin Marathon, where he started running around the prison yard for 26.2 miles. And over a period of time doing this, it became quite popular. And there's a documentary that was actually made about the San Quentin Marathon. Here's a self-portrait that he did, a lithograph in 2005. It's one of his favorite works, and he calls it his self-portrait with boots. And the cover of the book is a series by a currently incarcerated person, Mark Lafney, who's in Pennsylvania. And Mark Lafney, since 2014, has been doing these portrait sessions of other people who are serving time with him, where he asks people to sit for a 20-minute session. And in 20 minutes, he does these very beautiful graphite sketches. Over the course of the 6 years that he's been working on this project, he has amassed over 600 of these portraits. And they will also be on display at the PS1 exhibition when it opens. He's continued this practice during the pandemic. And so some of his most, if we have time in the end, I'll try to pull up his Instagram account, because some of his most recent portraits are of incarcerated people in PPE with masks on and the like. And so again, thinking about the work of non-incarcerated artists, I put the portrait work of incarcerated artists in conversation with some of the most well-known portrait artists of the contemporary era, like Kehinde Wiley, who's best known for his portrait of Barack Obama, for example. And he actually started doing a lot of his portrait work when he was a artist in residence at the Studio Museum on 125th Street in Harlem, and came across this mugshot posted on 125th of this young Black boy. And so he turned that mugshot into this really exquisite painted portrait, and that led him to do a series of portraits where he's elevating criminalized and everyday Black people. Titus Kaphar is another person who's done portrait work around and thinking about race and criminalization. And so the Jerome Project actually grows out of a database search in prison online databases, where he looked up his estranged father's name and came across several Black men in prison across the country who shared his father's name. And so he created this series using kind of Byzantine symbols to turn incarcerated people into these elevated subjects. So I think about that and the kind of serialization of that work in conversation with other incarcerated artists. And also the work of self-portraiture, which this is a self-portrait that Lisette did in 2013 that's like really richly symbolic, and it looks like Lisette and not like Lisette. And Lisette, can we talk about that together instead of just thumbs up? Because Lisette also has that work behind her, like where she's at right now. So we'll talk about that more, but I wanted to show you that. So self-portraiture is really important to incarcerated people, and in many ways, it's one of the only ways of self-representing against what I call criminal indexes, like the prison ID card. And here is one where Russell Craig, one of his first really works of art where he's kind of claiming the status of an artist, is he takes his prison ID card, and this is a visual stigma that incarcerated people have to wear around inside prisons. It's pinned to them. And he turned it into this work of art. And he said to me in an interview, he's like, I found the word art in Department of Corrections. And really, he said it was for him choosing this identity of this artist as an identity against the one that the state have forced upon him. And I'll show you a few more self-portraits, and then I'll stop there. And this is a really large self-portrait. This is 10 feet by 8 feet that Russell Craig made once he was released and on parole. And it consists of him collecting all of his prison documents over the course of many years, including being in the foster care system, and using that as the backdrop for this large self-portrait. And then James Huff, who I talked about earlier, who did the work I Am the Economy and Big House Products. This is a self-portrait he did that was very much inspired by thinking about some of his artistic influences, like like Basquiat, and he has the kind of crown that Basquiat would use in a lot of his work, but also a visit that Shepard Fairey had made to the prison where he's incarcerated. Shepard Fairey had given a lecture about art and social justice, and Shepard Fairey is known for his graphic works. He's best known for like the Obama Hope poster, and so you see the way that James Huff is kind of using some of those visual signals in this self-portrait right here. And then this is the final self-portrait I will show that connects to my chapter on solitary confinement. I opened the chapter actually with the self-portrait by the late Billy Sell, who was involved he was in solitary confinement and was involved in a hunger strike to end the horrific conditions of solitary confinement in California. It was a statewide protest, one that Billy Sell did not survive. It was a self-portrait he made several months before he was found dead in his cell. So I want to end there in his honor, and it's just a recognition of his life and all the people who are in prison right now, and the hundreds of thousands who are literally in solitary confinement as prison's response to the pandemic. So many people are suffering in solitary confinement as a way for prisons to curtail the massive spread of the virus inside carceral facilities. So Lisette, I'm going to pause and turn it over to you. Is that okay? Nigel, were you going to introduce Lisette formally? Did you? Do you have her bio? Sorry.
I'm here. Hi. Thank you very much. Is Nigel going to go on, or should I just continue?
I think you should. You need to be formally introduced. I'm sorry, Nigel.
All right.
Do you have that, or just can someone?
I think we were just gonna have Nicole, you pivot to Lisette and introduce her. That was the plan. So.
Okay. So I don't have Lisette's bio, so no, but I'll talk about how I know Lisette. I think I would like for someone to read her bio if we can put that up. So Lisette and I met in 2015. Lisette had just recently been released from New York, and she was involved in shared dining. And Lisette became this like really important interlocutor for me in terms of understanding like the risk involved and like the significance of art making in prison. Lisette also was really involved in creating a community among incarcerated women in New York, and part of that community was facilitated through art making. And she says the storytelling and the kind of sharing and safe space that was created in an otherwise horrifying space. Since being released from York, Lisette has gone on to, was accepted to Columbia University. She's now finishing her bachelor's degree, and she's working at the Center for Social Justice there, and involved also in the JIE program, which is a really great program that supports formerly incarcerated students at Columbia. And she's very active in helping to mentor a generation of people who are coming out of prison and pursuing higher education. So thank you, Lisette, for joining us.
Thank you all for being here. And I just have to admit that, watching you and watching all these beautiful art pieces and just talking about incarceration, the effects, and all the many themes interconnected one another, it's bringing a lot of emotions that I feel that I was not prepared, or I thought I was prepared for, but it's just like, wow, it's like everything together, and it's very powerful and it's very scary at the same time. So bear with me if I get a little bit emotional. I will not be ashamed of being emotional though, because I think that sets a lot and these are times where we need to really express how we feel. It's not what we feel, it's how we act and react to the emotions. But yeah, going back to the creation of shared dining, Shared dining, as you mentioned, was created at your correctional institution thanks to Elizabeth Sackler, who came in wanting to introduce to the women this understanding for Judy Chicago's iconic The Dinner Party and what it meant historically and in the feminist world and women and how women can tell and change their story by their own narratives. So after 10 of us gather in this wonderful space that we called York School, which is the school within the York Correctional Institution, and there's the library there where I worked at for the 4 years, almost 4 years that I think I worked 3 years out of the 4.5 years that I was incarcerated. And we were working under the direction of Joe Lee, who I've heard you mention of him in the past, as you mentioned of him in his book. He is the arts, the media specialist, and now a retired librarian that works for the Department of VOC in Connecticut. So in my time incarcerated at York CI from 2010 and 2013, the opportunity of creating this collaborative art piece or art installation among those women came through Elizabeth Sackler. And so I believe it was Tracy Bernardi, the one that actually was outspoken, and she was the one that brought this idea of, wait, how about we create our own version of shared dining as opposed to having to repeat the same characters and people involved in the actual dinner party. How about we select our own? So Elizabeth Sackler just felt this is a magnificent idea. And so we took some time to think. And the question was, think about a female figure, whether it is a living, dead image, something that has had an impact in your life, that's changed you, that means something, that it speaks to you in any way. At this time, 2013, I was going through a very important period in my life in respect to my sentencing, because when I went in, it was back in 2010, and I went in as a non-sentenced individual, which meant that my bail was set too high. I couldn't post bail. I couldn't bail out. So I had to go in and fight my case from the inside. And as those that have read the book will know, I went in because I got in a fatal car crash back in 2009 that took the life of Mrs. Phyllis Porter, a 77-year-old citizen that lived in Norwich, Connecticut. And so I caused a three-way car crash, and therefore I was responsible for her passing. And so I was charged with vehicular manslaughter. And from the moment that I went in 2010, not knowing anything about incarceration in the American system, as an immigrant that came into the US at age 17, escaping somewhat the issues and poverty and the politics happening also in Peru in a period where Alan Garcia was the president, and during his administration, there was so much crisis, financial crisis, that it was through his administration that it forced my parents to leave the Peru to come to the States. And so I end up in America, not knowing the language. Somehow I get in this car crash. Someone is dead. I am responsible for it. How do I deal with this? I go into prison not knowing, no understanding, let alone English language itself, because my only knowledge to the English language was the ABC, the numbers, and the colors. That's how I came to America. That's all I knew. And then it was through the years and my need to trying to adjust myself and be part of the community that I learned English. But yet, even when I learned English, I did not understand the law language. Like, what did this mean? What do you mean by a plea bargaining agreement? How do I know? Where's my trial? What is a speedy trial? There's so many moving pieces happening, moving too fast in that period where I just felt so overwhelmed, so scared. So from 2010 to 2013, this was the 3 years where, I continued to go to court and the case continued to move on. And 2013 was the year where I actually got sentenced. So when I got sentenced, when the program came, when Elizabeth Sackler came in and offered to create this art piece, and they asked, who do you want to celebrate? Who do you want to honor? Who do you admire? I felt at that moment that honoring Mrs. Phyllis Porter, even though I did not know her, but I knew that somehow our lives were connected in a tragic way. I felt as though this was going to be the opportunity that I had to create myself in order to start the healing process, in order to find a way to forgive myself, something that the structure of the penal system will not provide to us, right? We go in and the prison system, the uniform that we wear, the space that we're in, the holding cell we're in, it's just a reminder of that one moment of poor choice, of error, of human error that define us. So I use the art and I use this opportunity to say to myself, I can forgive myself. I can probably create a space where I can have Mrs. Phyllis Porter forgive me. And so in honoring Mrs. Phyllis Porter, I created that space that I needed for my own healing. So I decided to honor Mrs. Phyllis Porter. And as I had just gotten sentenced, I was also in open conversation with Mrs. Phyllis Porter's family members, particularly two of her daughters. And we were able to exchange letters. And when the opportunity came for me to bring shared dining to the Brooklyn Museum, I reached out to one of Mrs. Phyllis Porter's daughters and asked whether it would be okay for me to actually have this table setting, honor Miss Phyllis, and have her name, like the actual letters, the spelling of her name on it. And their response was positive, was loving, empowering. They said that they agree. They actually went to see the first exhibit of the piece, which was in Connecticut, one of the annual art exhibits run by Jeff Green, who's the person that brings in the arts into your correctional institution and provides materials for women to engage in creating art while they're there. So after that, then we moved shared dining to the Brooklyn Museum. And I think that having this art workshop land during that period where I was looking at getting sentenced and then honoring Mrs. Phyllis Porter really allowed for that moment or that time where not only I could heal, but I feel that also the Porter family were able to kind of come into terms with that and understand and show how compassionate they really are and how courageous they were in actually telling me, you know, we forgive you, we all make mistakes. I think that not every person that's in prison or many are deprived of, not all of us get to be forgiven. So in that sense, I think this art piece was certainly very, very, continues to be very meaningful to me and very moving. Even as I speak, I don't know if you sense it in the tone of my voice, I kind of feel like I'm breaking, I'm holding it back, but yeah, regardless of how many years go by, it just never changes. It's something that really touches me profoundly.
Lisette, are you okay with me sharing the screen and just so for people to see the work again? Because I think having you talk about it now, it's just so much more meaningful. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, totally.
So, Lisette, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so I'll show this one first and then I'll go back to shared dining because you told me there was so much in this that I think it would be great for you to talk
okay.
to the audience about.
This is what you started off with, but thanks to my ADD, I kind of jumped and went on to shared dining. So this is the other, after shared dining was created, I continue to create art and in my holding cell, I will have this Bristol board paper with pencil colors, and at this time they gave us these color pencils, watercolor pencils, which we wouldn't get, but this was a special time, a special treat. And so I decided I will tint the Bristol board of some color, decided between orange, yellow, just warm colors. And I figured I was going to do a self-portrait. But what I thought at that time, and this is also around the time where I was sentenced, and as mentioned, when the family were present the day of the sentencing, and that's where they publicly expressed that they forgave me, that we all made mistakes. They also gave me a picture of Mrs. Phyllis Porter, a beautiful 8x10 portrait of her. And the day of the sentencing, and this is back in January of 2013, I brought it into my holding cell. The judge allowed for me to have this picture brought into my holding cell, and I used toothpaste to kind of stick the picture, the 8x10, onto my wall. So she was the first person I will see in the morning. She was the last person I will see when I will go to bed. And having this picture of her, as opposed to bringing negative emotions and feelings of guilt, it somehow I managed to change that and change it to something that will be more empowering. So my motto from that day on was, I no longer live for me, but I live for you. I no longer see with my eyes, but I see through your eyes. You've forgiven me through the voice of your children. And as undeserving I am of forgiveness, I need to replicate and pass on this great opportunity and try to see the world in the same eyes or through the same lenses that Mrs. Phyllis Porter would have saw it, and as how the daughters and sons of Mrs. Phyllis Porter saw it when they openly said that they forgave me. So I figure I'm gonna create a self-portrait, but what has changed in me today, that it's not the same as how I was when I first came and walked in through the York CI gates. It was the fact that now I could see through a different type of eyes and different lenses. So I did a picture of myself and decided, well, I'm literally going to take the eyes from this picture. So I'm going to get her eyes with her glasses, because the picture she holds her reading glasses, and we'll insert those eyes as opposed to my regular eyes to represent that that person is me, but it's also her. And that
you faded for a second. Are you still there, Lisette?
yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
That I've changed in ways that may not be visible, but I knew that I was not only responsible for my life, but also living for her and through her eyes. So that's when I merged those two pieces together, and how I created this self-portrait.
Thank you, Lisette.
You're welcome.
So I'm going to, you decide if you want to talk about this or not. You don't have to, but I'm going to go back to the shared dining. So, because I think your explanation of how it came into being is so beautiful, and I think it will help people understand even more the significance of it. Sorry. And as you were saying that this, like the idea for this actually came from the women. It keeps sending me back. Who came from the women who were incarcerated with you. And I think part of the power of you, when you were telling me that story, was, it like challenges us who are involved in art, social justice, social service, human service, that to work with any kind of assumptions that we have that we're going in to provide service, and not without recognizing the kind of incredible assets and talents and ideas and ambitions of the people that we think we're serving. And so for me, like you saying that this was actually a project that like shared dining was inspired something that became this incredible collective process that you said it transformed all of you in the practice of making these works.
Yeah, it definitely did. In an environment where we are so afraid of one another, afraid of what's to happen tomorrow, so much uncertainty. So where the space that we're in, it's interesting in the sense that we're all in the same space together, but then we're so separate, divided. We're all trying to live each day that goes by, trying to keep a head over your shoulders and hoping that, you know, our release day will come somewhere down the road, and we're staying so much focused on trying to stay alive while we go through this journey, that we many times detach ourselves from the other misfortunes that other women are going through. In my period, in my 4 years and some months that I was inside your correctional institution, the number of suicide attempts were insanely almost once a week, and it just comes to show that prison is not a place where women just sit down and get fat and do nothing. It's not the playground that some officers and correctional officers will say. This is not playground, or you're here to just, you know, do nothing and then you get to go home. It's a very dark place, and the consequences of incarceration are so detrimental that even after you leave the physical structure and the space, you carry a form of prison within your head, unless you are, I don't know, from another world. But I think all of us, everyone who has had an encounter with the justice system knows that we have that problem up there, and it's because of incarceration and what it does to humans. So with shared dining, though, having the opportunity of having women who regularly will not gather because of the structure within the prison system, where you have a sentencing unit divided by buildings, that women who serve over 5 years will be in a certain building. Those who are about to go home will be on a different unit. So we're not really likely to mingle amongst us, but going through this experience and having this 6 months to work and dedicate our time in the creating process, created this form of womanhood where we became friends, and we are supposed to carrying on the same facade, the same mask that we wear every day, looking tough, that nothing touches us, because we don't want to look vulnerable, because we do not want to be bullied, because we don't want to expose their emotions, because we want to be desensitized to what's happening around us. When we see somebody being dragged on the floor, or being brought to solitary confinement, or fighting on the phone with someone, we disconnect ourselves from one another. We just focus on our own issues, on what we want, and with that we kind of go our own ways without really having a collective form of a community. But the creation of this program kind of broke away that structure that the system had created of women. So it was impressive how at the beginning we went in and we were so afraid of what we were doing, and somewhat a little critical of one another, right? And when I was confronted with this white cloth that Joe Lee had gotten from a dollar store, I believe he was joking about it one time, and have this acrylic paint come over, you know, it was a lot of uncertainty. Where do I go? And then this collective feeling of all of us women, I don't want to mess up. I don't want to screw up. How do I go about it? There's so much insecurity. And then to see that another person who has made mistakes in life and has paid huge prices for such mistakes comes to me and says, it's okay. Maybe you can do this, and cheer me on and say like, oh, this is beautiful. Then I wanted to replicate that same sort of comfort and an emotion to my other friend, and then I will go to another person next to me. Oh, that's beautiful. And one of them, would you help me with the lining? Of course I would. And it just, we became closer together, and we somehow learned to look at the positive within us and just be there for one another. I think that we would have never done it in a different environment while incarcerated in the prison, because we don't get to be together, and the times that we do, everything, it's just even for lunchtime or dinner time, it's so confined and it's structured in a way that you eat, you get up, and then you go to your holding cell. That's it. So
Lisette, thank you so much. I'm going to have Nigel join us, because I know Nigel, he's very inspired by what you were sharing too, and Nigel has experience also teaching teaching through San Quentin. Is that correct, Nigel?
Yes.
Yeah. So we're all three going to talk for about 10 minutes and then open it up for Q&A. Is that right?
That'd be great. I mean, I'm just struck by the conversation that Nicole, you and Lisette are having. And Lisette, you said this thing that the prison does to humans. Yes, and what I understand is that there are two currents here. There is the current that is happening in the carceral space with the prison, the structure of the prison, and which is about inhumanity, and you are finding ways through art, through your relationships with the other women, through your exchanges to retain your humanity. And it has enabled this human act of forgiveness to take place with the family. And when I'm reading Marking Time, I notice that there's this chapter, Interior Subjects, in which Nicole writes about prison portraiture and how it connects, she writes, quote, connects with a vibrant tradition of Black, brown, and indigenous artists and activists creating portraiture to visualize their humanity, aspirations, and collective struggles through the long durée of racial subjugation in this country. So I'm struck by, in both the book and also in this dialogue and this conversation, in which it is very clear that privileging the humanity and the human, the use of language, and Nicole, in the book, your intentionality about resisting and also interrogating the grammar of incarceration, in which it participates in that dehumanization. And that even when you make a distinction between prison art and prisoner art, or when you talk about how those who are artists assert their presence, when you quote Tayari Jones's work in talking about incarcerated humans stripped of family, there's this emphasis on the human, and there's a way in which you write, and that you are very careful about the decisions you make concerning language to always privilege, right, the humanity of those who you're writing about. And so I'm listening to the conversation between you and Lisette, and it is similar in that privileging of humanity. And that is contrary to what's happening outside or within the public sphere. With those that I've encountered when I've had the experience to be in the classroom inside, the question, one of the major questions is, how do we get the public to understand that we are human? And I think, and listening to you and Lisette in discussion, and also reading the book and the careful decisions you make in that regard, this is something that is very much at the forefront. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, and I'll say something really briefly, because I want to hear more from Lisette, that like early on when I started presenting and I just was showing the pictures of my family, someone came to me and said, oh my goodness, I've never thought of people in prison as being loved. And they didn't mean that they meant it like in a aha moment, because public discourse is all about turning incarcerated people into undeserving subjects, and love as like one of the most foundational experiences we all need, right? So I committed in writing this book that anyone I wrote about, there for me had to be an ethic of love and care around how I talked about their experience, their art, their family. and that they could recognize themselves in the writing. And so Lisette will even tell you, like, I shared with Lisette what I wrote, and Lisette had feedback. So it's like I was in conversation, everyone I wrote about, where possible, I shared with them what I was writing. So for me, that is part of the reciprocity, the kind of love that I wanted to put into practice, of recognizing that, like, people who have suffered have shared their suffering with me in order for me to make this book.
Lisette, do you recall that experience, or do you want to comment on that? Or?
Experience of meeting up with Nicole,
Yeah,
and talking of, well, we talked about so many themes, and even after I was released from prison and met her, I think we also discussed the immigration case, because, as an immigrant who has a criminal record, we have a double jeopardy, right? We penalize and punish on one aspect, and then the moment I got out, I had to now get through this other issue in this secondary form of incarceration, where I was also brought. I had an open case with immigration, and I fought a deportation case, which thanks to God and great institutions such as Columbia University, and also Nicole Fleetwood wrote letters on my behalf. The judge, again, one of those moments that I don't see happen too often, granted me the right to stay in America, and that's why I stay here today. But yeah, we communicated a lot, and when we met in multiple spaces, in one of the, I think was it in East Harlem, that we met with Isaac.
Yeah, and then at the Bronx when you did the show there. So this,
yes, the Freeman House. Yeah, I mean, the whole experience of being able to take a pause and really look at art and try to see really what is behind, and what is the story, and what the art is trying to tell us is something that needs to be valued. Because in my experience, I felt as though I couldn't use language to really express how I felt, even in my years of incarceration and through psychologists and speaking with the administration. The arts system, in a way that it became a medium where I can let my emotions out, and many times I didn't even know what I was feeling. It's like so many emotions all at once that is just swirling inside, and then with the stroke of a brush, by mixing colors and just letting your emotions go, I felt as though that was the most therapeutic form of healing that I was able to get, that I couldn't have gotten with a professional inside the prison, going on a meeting once a month. So certainly art and the way it speak to us is of profound importance. And I think the work that Nicole and the dedication that Nicole has taken in really going all around the US looking for art. And that was one of the questions. I don't know if this will be the right time to ask, but
Me too.
Yeah. So Nicole, the question to me, I know you interview, and you saw in the past 10 years during the making of this book, so many art pieces, interviews, so many individuals. And I know that because of the size of the book, you had restrictions as to how many pieces you get in. Have there been any conflicts within you? Pieces that you thought were worthy of being, well, all of them, I suppose, were worthy, but pieces that you really wanted, but because of whatever circumstances couldn't be there, but they still resonate in you, and you kind of go like, gosh, I wish this one was in the book.
Yeah, and
what are they?
It was actually very hard. I mean, I actually had an entire chapter that was looking at just color in prison, and how people improvise, how they make color, the limitations on color, the way that color is used to like racially segregate people. That entire chapter didn't make it. That, like, my editor, one of my early editors cut it, and it felt like gutting me. It really, and at some point maybe I'll turn that into an article. And then there were probably 30 people I interviewed whose words have informed what I've written, and they're my acknowledgments, but I wasn't able to actually include quotes from them in the book. And that's also really painful when you have to cut, when there's just like a limit on what you can put between covers of a book. And I'm really grateful that I have this experience to curate at PS1, because I do feel like I'm able to expand what I couldn't do in the book. So it's totally grows out of the book, but I'm also able to expand and include some different things that I wasn't able to include in the book. So thank you for that opportunity to share that.
Nicole, you write about some of the challenges that you encounter in doing this work, and one might think that those challenges are about access or what the administration allows in terms of entering into the prison, what kind of access you have. But you write also about the challenges that you faced with arts organizations. And I wonder, in this section in which you use the term fraught imaginaries, and you expand on this notion of fraught imaginaries, could you talk about that? I found this.
That was the most difficult chapter to write, actually. And it's a chapter where I look at collaborations and organizations that have built their reputation on collaborating with incarcerated people. And I really wanted to have a do no harm ethic around that. So there were some practices and dynamics that I felt critical of. But at the same time, I wanted to write about it in an honest and hopefully useful way without jeopardizing people who were sharing with me or jeopardizing funding or, support systems for these organizations. And so I was getting at like just the fact that when people collaborate with incarcerated people, incarcerated people are non-consenting beings, meaning that they're in a status of, they're legally unfree. So even if they say they're going to join a program, they can't legally consent, and that there's an ethic around that. And also like when people collaborate with incarcerated people and then display the work outside of prisons, often incarcerated people have no idea like how that work is circulating, the audience, the kind of intention, the even intentionality of the artist going into that. So I just was saying that there is like, there's a lot of work to be done. The work is not to not do this collaboration, but the work is to do it with a real ethic and rigor, and also a commitment to ending the very conditions that allow for that collaboration, the very conditions that allow for hyper-incarceration.
Yeah, thank you. I want to ask you about the book, and it's, now that it is out, its circulation. Have the artists who are featured in the book, have they seen the book? Have you talked to them about the book? And what have been the responses? What has been the travel, the circulation of the book, if you will? While you answer that, I would ask that those in the audience or in the virtual world, if you have questions, please do write them into the chat, and then we can present them to Nicole and Lisette.
So I thank you for that question, because for me, something that's been really deeply meaningful is that Harvard and I were able to work with the Art for Justice Fund, which is a fund that was partly spearheaded by a large donation that Agnes Gunn, the social justice philanthropist Agnes Gunn, gave to create a fund to fuel projects aimed at ending mass incarceration. And Art for Justice underwrote a special edition of the book that's a paperback version. We printed 1,000 copies to send to incarcerated people for free. And they were the first readers of my book. So that special edition was released in March, but the book didn't come out to April 28th. So my very first readers were incarcerated people. And it was incredibly moving to start getting emails and correspondence from incarcerated people before the broader public had even read the book. And so, for example, Mark Lafney, who gave me permission to use his art on the cover, he wrote this beautiful letter saying that he was just in tears reading the book because he had felt like the work he had been doing was totally in isolation, not knowing that there were people across the country similarly engaged. And he said it was just super empowering to him. And since then, he's reached out to like James Huff and other artists who are in the book. And they are like literally, for me, I was hoping to create like in some ways a symbolic community, but people are actually creating community based on being put in proximity in the book.
That is, I mean, I think of books that come from university presses and they are in a certain location. Your book, I encounter your books everywhere, right? I mean,
Oh, that's kind of you.
Yes, so that I think that's amazing. And also in the particular moment with the pandemic, that your books are going inside a space that we're having difficulty with in terms of the health of those who are inside and incarcerated, and also having trouble getting in materials. So I think this was quite remarkable.
And I got an email. I get emails. Like I got an email from a help me out, spiritual figure who works across religious, like chaplain. I was like, I just had a brain like a chaplain in at a prison in Canada who works with Indigenous incarcerated artists, and we were able to send books there to Canada. And then I just got an email from someone who works with a group of people in Illinois, and they do like a correspondence reading group. And she's not allowed in during the COVID, but they're still able to get packages. So we sent books there. So for me, that's been really like, I can't say how important. It's been super meaningful having the book circulate among the people who shared their stories with me. Lisette, and through the JIE program, which I said was the formerly incarcerated students at Columbia, they're doing a reading group based on the book, right, Lisette?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for extending that donation to the JIE scholars. You know, many of us JIE scholars are advocates for social justice, and many of us use the arts, and given our background and our encounter with the justice system, this book is certainly one of the things that we can't wait to get our hands on. So we're in the midst of figuring out what days, but we are certainly working on creating a book club of some sort, and just discussion and learn more about the artists featured in this book.
Thank you. Nicole, there's a question for you. And this question is, in the time that has passed since you first start putting the photos of your family up in your home to where your project is now, what has most surprised you as you've worked on this project, if anything?
Oh my goodness, that's like an incredible question. I mean, I think like I've gotten so much, and I've gotten so much from this project that all the labor, and this is like totally a labor of love, and it's been really hard in so many ways, but I have been blown away by the generosity of, especially of incarcerated people. So the reputation and the kind of mainstream media visuals of prison is so obscene and sensationalizing. There's so much care and mentoring that takes place inside prisons. If there wasn't that, there would be mass death all the time. But in fact, there's actually a like high level of civility and care and generosity, and people sharing materials. I mean, that's the only way. Like a lot of people realize in prison, they have to survive collectively under like some of the most austere and authoritarian conditions. And it's been incredible to be like a student, to learn how people are navigating, how people are communicating across solitary confinement cells, how they're looking out for someone who might be on suicide watch or having other kind of health crises, right? And so it's like, to me, it's just like these kind of tools of understanding that we have to practice being in it all together and collective care, like in every single way. And this is a crucial moment for us outside of prison to really put that into practice, right? That like we're under this ongoing pandemic, this like crisis in leadership, upcoming elections, right? So for me, there's just so much in terms of like how we build community, how we survive, how we envision freedom and repair and healing. Hearing Lisette talk for me is like, it is such a lesson in healing and like self-healing, like a type of accountability. Lisette also saying, being able, never imagining herself in prison, but then recognizing herself in everyone she comes across, right? Seeing like that recognition is so fundamental to everyone in terms of like being acknowledged as a human, being, you know, having a viable life, being forgiven if we have caused harm, which we all cause harm, whether we're in prison or not, right? So there's just all these, so much that I can just write another book about what I've learned from working on this book. But hearing Lisette, every time I hear Lisette tell us about her experience and like what it means to become to take account and to heal and to connect, is like, it's so powerful. It's it's a book in itself, you know?
Agreed, yes. Another question, Nicole. In your research of materials and conducting interviews for the book, did you encounter narratives from incarcerated artists that explored the tensions around sentencing disparities between drug-related charges and conversations about opioid use and possession in comparison to other drug charges like crack cocaine? So a question about the sentencing disparities in terms of those that you've encountered.
Yeah. I mean, that's a fantastic question. So it definitely came up in terms of artists talking about it. For example, Jesse Crimes, who's, I showed you the prison bed sheets, he was sentenced. I don't talk about why people were sentenced unless that's a story that they want me to share. And so for Lisette, it was a very important part of her story and a part of her art making. Jesse Crimes is someone else who talked about being sentenced for nonviolent drug charges. And he's a white artist from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And for him, it became a moment where he learned also about, as he's being sentenced, also about white privilege, because he said there was a guy that same morning, a black guy was accused of having the same amount of drugs and was giving 3 times the length of a sentence than what he was given. He was given 5 years, this guy was given 15 years, right? So it's been, for me, amazing to hear the artists talk about, like, so my theorization and the knowledge that I'm building in the book is coming from those who are directly impacted. I'll put it that way. That's like the source of like kind of my theorization and the knowledge production in the book.
And that source and that theorization comes from what you mentioned early in the book and just now, that you do not inquire about the crime committed, and it's interesting that that is important for you, that you do not ask that, yet there are scholars, that is the very first question they ask, right? And I think it's a very important distinction in terms of the direction of the type of work that's being done. Here's a question. Having the book first read by the incarcerated people and the artists featured, what was the most inspiring response you got?
People telling me they were recognized, like they were deeply recognized and they felt cared for, you know.
Lisette, there's a question, curious if there's work being done with restorative justice programs and the making and sharing of art. This is for Nicole and Lisette. I was struck by Lisette's portrait with the eyes and glasses of the woman killed, and what a potential gift of forgiveness and love it could be for a grieving family. I could imagine it being an outcome of a restorative justice intervention. So a question about programs in relationship to restorative justice.
Many of the organizations that I focus on, they do restorative justice work, and some do more abolitionist work, which I identify as abolitionist. Lisette's been involved in programs since she's been released from prison. And I think Lisette, can you just tell people a little bit more about the JIE, what you do at the center, and also the JIE program? Because many of the people are affiliated with Columbia, and I think it would be great for them to know about these organizations here.
Yes, this is what part of the questions are, to know about Lisette and her artistic work and what she's doing during the pandemic, and also to know more about her organization. Yes.
Yeah, so the Justice in Education is an initiative created in collaboration between the Center for Justice and the the Heyman Center for the Humanities. And what it does is it has created these two courses, they call it the Gateway courses, where they allowed formerly incarcerated individuals to reach higher education on campus, Columbia campus, by taking these two initial courses. One is based on writing skills, and they're all credited courses by Columbia. And then as they get through the course, then they are allowed to continue to take multiple classes. And eventually the goal is to have individuals register as either, I would say, will be GS students and get a bachelor's degree. And so the whole idea behind is to change the story and allow people to have higher education experiences so they can change the narrative behind what it means to be incarcerated in America today, and how do we change the way in which people with a criminal record are perceived, and how that is going to impact our future, right? Like nowadays, it's so hard to get a job with a criminal record. So having this opportunity by a great institution, by Columbia, I think it speaks highly about the importance of having to end this form of mass incarceration that is impacting everyone's life in America, and what a best way to do it than through education. And so just like Columbia, there are many other institutions. While I was incarcerated, Wesleyan University had a program of college courses that were brought into the prison, which I benefit from. And this was the first time that I took higher education while incarcerated. So that was an interesting experience for me to dive into. And so my work, I assist the Center for Justice and the Heyman Center with the JIE when it comes to workshops. We try to maintain this JIE community among former JIE scholars and incoming scholars. And so I serve as a person that can be of assistance to students that are struggling or are insecure about taking that big leap of faith, because it's really intimidating to come from a background like myself, that I have no higher education, and I felt as though my education level was not really up to an Ivy League standards, and it was very intimidating for me to really take that leap of faith and really, believe in myself and do it, particularly when incarceration, many years of incarceration, does a lot of damage to the brain and to your spirit. So I recall many times, even post release, always being haunted by these voices, and it's just a repetitive lifestyle of the prison itself, and always being assumed to be unworthy and undeserving, or that voice saying, oh yeah, we'll see you back. And so, but thanks to the support of individuals like Mr. Lee, who was the person that mentioned, hey, there's a program at Columbia University, I was able to break through that barrier. And today I am very proud to be working for Columbia and being able to reach out to other individuals that are going through the same problems and insecurities, and let them know that they will not do it alone, that there's a team standing behind to them, and that we understand, and then we'll be there for them all the way through, and we are growing. And I'm just very proud of the work that the Heyman Center and the Center for Justice are doing in respects to the JIE program.
Lisette, do you have thoughts on this imagining or this creating of this world without human cages that Nicole points us toward? How do we create that?
Well, I don't think it's something that we can just envision. I think it's something that is needed. I think we reached a point where we know that a penal system that just punishes, it's not the way in which we can change society. We need to change the way in which we see the justice system, and to punish, it's not a way to change an individual. We have to see imprisonment as if you were to see a child, and when the child misbehaves, you don't just embarrass them publicly, you don't humiliate them, you don't remove their identity and you tell them they are bad. They are human, they're kids, they're growing, they're learning. They just chose the way that isn't good for them, that is eventually going to hurt them, that you are protecting them. So you teach them and you shape and you help them shape the way in which they're seeing life. And I think that's what we need. We don't need any more solitary confinement. We don't need any life-term sentencing in order to change the way in which people behave in the world. And before we sentence someone, I think we need to look at what leads to someone to commit a crime. What are the actual social issues that individuals are going through? Because incarceration is just one aspect, is removing people that behave in a certain way that are harmful to themselves and others. It's not gonna be restored by just removing them from society. To start off, we have to see what is wrong in society that has a certain group of individuals behaving in a way that it's harmful to them and others. And then what can we do to change that? How can we change their mindset? How can we allow them to see life in a different way so that they can live life that will be in accordance with the standards of society? And certainly, there is some work being done. Your correctional institution is one of the prisons that today are focusing and veering towards a restorative form of justice, and that is being practiced on the East campus as the minimum security as opposed to the maximum security. So I believe that there's also a great job that the Human Center is creating with Mia Roger, who also goes to prisons in New York, like Rikers Island, and provide different forms of classes, from writing courses and art, that are also changing the narrative by the work that these many volunteers from Columbia and Barnard do, as well as the professors that go in and spend a lot of time teaching. And through education, we think that we can find that and just teach and have them change that mindset.
Right. Thank you, Lisette. Yes.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for.
Thank you. It's been great to be in conversation with both of you.
Yes,
Thank you.
You both are so inspiring.
I'll turn it back to Nellie now.
Oh, just thank you so much, all three of you, for this incredible evening. Really, just so moving, and yeah, no words. Just thank you so much, and thank you everyone else for joining us. I can't even think of what I should say in closing. I guess if you're interested in more about narrative medicine, find us on social media. That's basically the place you'll learn about any upcoming events. And I don't know, I'm speechless. This is so wonderful. Thank you so much, all of you, again. And Joe, if I missed break in, but I think we're
good. We have the links here on the slide for people to find us on the web and to buy books. I put those in the chat as well.
Go to bookshop.org to get the book from there, so you can support independent bookstores. There it is. But yes.
Thank you all. Thanks to everyone who made this possible. Thank you all so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Both Nicole and Lisette, thank you. Great to hear you tell your story and share your experiences.
Thank you, Lisette.
Thank you, Nigel. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your time.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Lisette and Nigel, let's stay in touch, okay?
Absolutely.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.